What is up, everybody? Welcome back to the Geek Pantheon. I am Eric, and today I have a very special guest. I am joined by Tom of No Rolls Barred fame, Blood on the Clock Tower, various board game club appearances. And yeah, I will let you take over the introduction from here, Tom. Thank you for joining me on the channel.
Oh, my pleasure to be here, really. I feel deeply flattered that someone wants to hear what I have to think. Hi, yeah, I'm Tom. You might know me from the board game channel No Rolls Barred. I'm also a pro DM who mostly focuses on the therapeutic benefits of role play and tabletop play. And yeah, I guess that's me. I'm not a complicated man.
Also, CBW is on the Parts Fun Known channel. Am I
Oh,
remembering
yes.
that correctly?
And
Yes.
CBW, yes.
Some more
Although I
tabletop
will
role playing
say,
game goodness.
if you're gonna watch anything that I put out into the world, do insist that you watch Dread. It's definitely a
Oh,
thing that I'm
yes.
the most proud of.
Yes, it is very well done. I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. And great transition, Tom. You're a pro at this because we are talking horror tabletop role playing. It's June. It's the season for horror, right? Watch this now. And then by the time October comes around, you'll be prepared to run a spooky one shot for your friends or family. But yeah, Tom, that's why I reached out to you to ask you to be on the channel outside of finding you to be a very charming and engaging person to watch in general on YouTube. Also, your experience with horror tabletop role playing games, because in addition to watching you with the Dread series and also you play in the Call of Cthulhu, there have been multiple references just with you on screen from other people on the channel. Adam talking about you running horror games and being very good at it, at least in their estimation. So, which if your players are enjoying what you're doing, what else matters? So, I wanted to talk horror because for me personally, I tend to have some difficulty making that genre really sing at the table. And so I thought it'd be fun to sit down and have a chat, and I can pick your brain and steal all your good ideas for my use at my table. So
You're also welcome to any of the bad ones as well.
yes, of course. So I guess take me back to your personal history with tabletop role playing and then what you enjoy about horror specifically when it comes to running games.
Okay, so personal history wise, I played a little bit of D&D as a kid many years ago and didn't really spend any time with a hobby until I would say around my late 20s when I think it was around the time Critical Role was a good few episodes into its existence,
Mhm.
into campaign 1, and it had somehow ended up on my recommended feed on YouTube, and I'd started thinking about getting back into it. And I was running a small theatre in South London at the time, co-running with a good friend, and I was walking through our office just to get a pair of scissors and overheard one of the cast members from a show that we were looking after at the time mention Critical Role to someone else in that room. And, "Oh, you watch Critical Role?" And he said he did. And we got chatting, and I found out he'd recently also got back into the hobby and had run a few sessions of a new D&D campaign and invited me to join. And after a few weeks, I joined his campaign, played my first D&D session as a player, as an adult, and left it feeling this is one of the greatest things I've ever done in my entire life. Why doesn't everyone do this all the time?
Yeah.
And that was really my gateway back into it. And then I started getting interested in different systems. I've always had a strong like for horror. And a someone who actually played in the early D&D campaign, who some of you may know from NRB, Dom Allen, has
Yeah.
been a long time player of Call of Cthulhu, and he introduced me to Call of Cthulhu. And off the back of that, I found out about other systems like Dread and Ten Candles. And I just found myself really enjoying running horror games. I I'm not sure what this says about me. I feel like I'm very good at being cruel. Not in real life. I consider
Yeah.
myself hopefully quite a decent person. But there's something about the way horror role playing allows players, GMs to explore the kind of worst parts of humanity, the kind of worst parts of themselves. Worst is maybe too much of a black and white word, but the darker
The
parts
less
of
desirable.
ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah, the darker parts of humanity in a safe environment with clear boundaries. I think there's something really cathartic about getting to embrace darker but very natural impulses within a safe context that everyone is
Yeah.
consented to be part of. It's very therapeutic. And my bent is always what's therapeutic about role play and how can we maximize that?
Yeah.
So I really like that aspect of
That.
horror. And I think a lot of what I just loved about horror as a genre in general are the same things I love about horror role playing, but it's just so much more, I think, immersive and so much more
Yeah.
to play in a story rather to read one. I do feel that it is the deepest form of storytelling, role play, tabletop role play.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
and yeah, horror role playing is a chance to enjoy the things I like about horror, but on a deeper level, and a chance to be really cruel and really spooky. It's fun to scare people.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's fun to make people unnerved, uneasy.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think that you really hit on something because I also have a theater background. My home game is populated with most of the cast of the last play that I did. I just asked a couple of them, like, hey, I'm thinking of starting a game. And then somebody, like what you're speaking about, somebody else in the makeup area was like, oh, can I get on that? And most of them are brand new players. They had heard about D&D. There was an opportunity. And so now I have 9 people at my table and it's a chaotic mess of theater people just doing what they do. But it's a blast. I think that what you spoke on, like getting to examine and experience these very like impulses and the darker aspects of humanity, I think is also something that I found doing theater as well. Like you have these very cathartic moments where you're experiencing these things. And I think role play and going towards the more horror genre or even suspense or thriller of just examining the darker aspects of humanity and society in general can be this intriguing and immersive thing for players because we all enjoy, most people enjoy the Tolkienic, like high fantasy, black and white, good and evil, heroes win the day stories. But at the same time, there is a place at the table for, I would say, the polar opposite, where it's there is no good or evil. There is no inherent right or wrong. There's survival. And what are you willing to do to survive? And I think that for both as a GM and a player, you can examine cruelty in a unique way because in a lot of circumstances that you find in the horror genre, whether you're reading stories, consuming movies, or role playing, there's oftentimes circumstances where in any other genre it would be abject, unforgivable cruelty that is what's necessary to see another day. And so it's very compelling and interesting as a genre. And I think a reason a lot of people want to run a horror game or want to play in one, but there's difficulty in that. And I think because the predominant system is D&D, followed up by like Pathfinder, and then I think Call of Cthulhu is actually, from a market share standpoint, third now. Savage World is also right there. But with those two systems in particular, you see a heightened sense of power from the player characters, which makes horror very difficult because I think a lot of what drives horror storytelling is a sense of either isolation or helplessness or both. D&D and Pathfinder don't do either of those well because you're an adventuring party of powerful individuals. So you had mentioned a couple, but I'd like to speak for people that want to do this and aren't afraid to try a new system. Your favorite systems, you had mentioned being proud of your work with Dread, but just the systems when you're wanting to do horror really well, what are the first things you're going to grab off your shelf to put on a table?
I think it does depend a little bit on the group, but in a lot of ways, I feel like Dread is my go-to introduction to horror system. I think it also doubles in some cases a really good introduction to RPG system as well, because there's no
Yeah.
dice, there's no elements that I think sometimes the polyhedrals can feel a little unfamiliar or
Hmm.
sometimes a little bit too nerdy for people who have those kind of judgments about the hobby.
Yeah.
But everyone knows Jenga, and it's a very easy thing to get behind. Introducing that idea of you describe what your character does, and if there's a chance you might fail, or if success or failure might be interesting, then we introduce a resolution mechanic. And as a resolution mechanic, I think Jenga is one of the easiest ones to get on board. It's very
Yeah.
simple. You pass or you fail. I think for introducing horror as well, playing a game of Jenga, even without a horror storyline running behind it, is an inherently tense experience.
There's a sense of rising action just in the game mechanic. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so I feel the tower does some of the heavy lifting in a horror game because people are nervous about the tower falling. Being asked to make a pull immediately makes people nervous because even when the tower is doing well, I feel, even when it's early on in the game, that first moment a block doesn't come out easily. That first moment something seems a bit stuck or someone has trouble looking for one that seems to come out. I think everything starts to get a little more tense. And it's such a good metaphor for those kind of actions in horror stories where someone is putting themselves in danger in order to get to safety or in order to find something else out. I think one of the kinds of pulls I really enjoy in Dread is when someone pulls to discover something, because this feels like a very Lovecrafted thing almost, because then they always have the option to not know, that knowledge is dangerous, that uncovering this bit of info or delving this little bit deeper into what's really going on comes with an inherent risk. And the safest thing to do is not to know. Ignorance is bliss and all that. So I feel those kind of situations, the tower just does a lot of the heavy work for. I think another thing Dread does really well. And whenever I talk about Dread, I say that the tower is the elevator pitch, the tower is the gimmick, but the beauty of Dread as a system is the character questionnaires and the way the character questionnaires are written. It's always really interesting, difficult questions like, why is there a photo in your wallet of someone you've never met? What were you told? I think this is one from Hope Puckett's character from Dread, was because as a player, Holly was very interested in exploring themes of alchemy and the supernatural to a certain extent. So she got given, what did the witch woman say about you when you were born, and why does it break your heart to know it isn't true? And a lot of the questions are based around this dichotomy of, I think particularly for me, around how characters see themselves and how they're seen by other people and the conflict between those two things, their insecurities, their fears, that kind of stuff. And I feel those questionnaires and the way you're encouraged to write those questions, by the time you finish working through that with a player, they're really heavily invested in their character. And I feel for a horror game, that's really important, particularly for horror one-shots. Because I feel in a horror one-shot, I think it's very hard to make players scared in a horror one-shot compared to often a campaign, because they know it's going to be 3-4 hours. They assume they're going to die at the end. Sometimes they're even thinking about, how can my character die in a cool and fun way? And so the threat of death isn't really a threat for them. Horror campaigns, I feel, fix that problem because you want to survive throughout that game. And the need to survive, I think, the desire for your character to survive is really essential for making those games tense. And if you have a one-shot, then I feel a really good character creation process is the best solution for that problem. Is by the time you finish working with that player and that character, you ideally want them to really care about the person, really want them to make it through. And the level of depth the Dread questionnaires go into, I think, facilitate that.
Yeah.
So I think those are the two big reasons why Dread is often the go-to, is it makes you invested in your character and therefore fearful of death and therefore fearful. And the tower itself just creates this atmosphere of tension right from the get-go.
No, I love that. I saw one technique that I have not done myself, but I heard about it from a fellow DM and friend who's used it to great effect at their Halloween one-shots, where it only really works with new players who don't see it coming. It can work on repeat, but it's very effective the first time, where you have everybody create their characters, and he runs in D&D, but have everybody create their characters, and you do this at the table together. You spend time developing the relationships and who they are. And then the first hour, everybody plays their characters and develops this level of investment in them. And then everybody takes their character and passes it one player to the right. Because while you don't mind your character thinking of a cool way for them to die, oh, now I'm responsible for Tom's character. And I don't, Tom really likes this character. I don't want to, and so it creates this whole other sense of, you're fine killing your own character, but you don't want to kill someone else's, but now you're in control of that character. And he says that moment is always wonderful because, yeah, the investment just goes up so much higher when you're given the responsibility of somebody else's character instead of your own. That's worked really well for him.
I haven't tried. That's really interesting. I'm going to have to give that a try. Because 10 Candles as a system, in character creation for 10 Candles, it asks you to create it's been a little while since I've run it, but like a positive and a negative trait for your
Hmm.
character. So they might be brave, but they also might be deceitful, or they might be strong, but they might be addicted. And you create a positive the first time. You can only really do it the first time someone plays 10 Candle. But you create this positive and negative trait for your character, and then you pass the positive trait to the player to your left and the negative trait to the player to your right, or vice versa. And everyone ends up, everyone ends up playing a character who has been defined by someone else. It's not quite the same feeling of what you're talking about there, of finding yourself responsible for a character who is really important to another player at that table. But I think this is something that even Call of Cthulhu does well in its randomized attribute roles,
Hmm.
is right from character creation, compared to the power fantasy of D&D, some control is taken out of your hands. Whether it's, oh, we created a character, but you're not going to play them, or someone else has decided what your main traits are, or the dice have randomized and decided that you might have gone into this game wanting to play a circus strongman with a high constitution, and you find yourself stuck playing a tiny, weak old man, but with an insane intellect and a peerless education.
Yeah.
And for me, yeah, I think there's something around that. I think there's something around getting players used to from the get-go that this isn't a power fantasy game, and things are going to happen to you, big, important things, which are really going to change your experience of this game that are entirely out of your control. And I agree with you entirely that D&D is a power fantasy, and I don't mean that as a criticism at all. I think that's its strength. I
Yeah.
think what's wonderful about D&D is getting to portray like an aspirational version of yourself and have that kind of grand impact on the world around you in a way that you often can't do in real life. I think that's what
Yeah.
really appealed to me when I first got back into D&D is, oh, I can do good on a scale so much broader than I can do the level of heroism that's available to me.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real strength of D&D. But you comparing it to them being their polar opposites, I think heroic roleplay, like power fantasy heroic roleplay, and then horror roleplay really are the two ends of the roleplay experience. Because for
Hmm.
horror to work, you have to have your power reduced, threatened. You need to be significantly powerless, I think, to be a protagonist in something that really feels like a horror experience.
Yeah.
Is my
Yeah.
reckoning.
Yeah, and I do think there's an interesting distinction that if whoever's watching this video or you and I in reality are setting out to do spooky one shot or a horror campaign or game, there needs to be an important distinction that the players are involved in the conversation of who am I seeking to scare and disturb? Are my players wanting a horror experience themselves, or are they wanting to play an atmospherically horror game where their characters are disturbed, but they are not? Because I do think those are two very different games to be run. And so that's an important thing as a responsible GM that you should ask your players. I do think that dread can rise the tension and you can have this sense of feeling, whereas something like 10 Candles seems to be much more, especially if you do it as desired by the rulebook, where you turn off all the lights and the candles are the only thing in the room providing light. That can actually provide an even more feeling of horror and dread in the room. And if you have somebody that's scared of the dark, genuine fear. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. That's a really good point you raise about. That's a great way of phrasing it too. About who are you trying to scare, the players or the characters or both? Because in terms of creating a horror gaming experience that really feels like there's an actual sense of weight and dread and horror to it, the Session Zero is the most important tool, I think, in doing that. I have memories of this was when I was just getting back into role playing games, and I discovered the system Cthulhu Dark, which is a kind of bare bones crafting system. And I had this
Hmm.
great horror mystery game planned set in the Scottish Highlands. It's one of the ones from the book. I was really interested in the themes in that story and creating this really tense kind of experience. And we sat down to play, and it was like 3 hours of absolute mayhem and nonsense. And I
Hmm.
remember leaving that game feeling really frustrated that the experience that I had wanted just had not happened. And looking back on that now as an older person, I recognize that what happened there is that there was no conversation between me or the players about what is the tone we're after here.
Yeah.
Because I think they had just really wanted to have a fun goof around with their pals, when I'd really wanted to do something a little different, and that conversation hadn't happened, and so the game ended up being fun and goofy. Establishing the players before you start that we're looking for something, we're going to do something with a heavy tone, that we are My aim is to run a game which is very emotionally explorative, which really hangs on existential horror, where there's a place for humor but isn't a humorous game. Like, how does that sound to everyone there? How does everyone feel about
Yep.
it? And going from session 0 into the start of your game with everyone being on the same page is probably more effective than any tower or any music or any bells and whistles you can add on for making sure you have the tone you're after.
100%. And all the other aspect from a session 0 standpoint that I did want to touch on since we're talking about this topic, because when I was first getting into D&D back in the 4th edition days, and I was not the GM at this time, but there were like 5 of us in a gaming group. And that particular summer, I was still a student. Another friend was still a student. One was a teacher, or the other 2 were teachers. So we had the summer off. So we literally would play 40 hours in a week of D&D. We would just get together for hours upon hours every day and play. And the GM was wanting to do a horror adventure. And he was telling me about, like, he's working on it and playing it. I was a player in the game, but I knew that one of the other players in the game, and he did not know this, was deathly afraid of spiders. And because I was not as thoughtful a person as I am now, I told the DM, oh, you should put spiders because Brad is going to freak out. Not Brad's character, Brad the player. And that is not something I should have done, nor something anybody should do without the full consent of the player who has the phobia. Because I think there is an impulse to pull on those threads when you're trying to run a horror game. And if your players consent to that, that is a conversation that you have had and gotten their consent. If they do not consent, then you should absolutely not. I, like many people in the hobby, have lines and veils, X cards. All of those tools are present at my table. And I think they are as important, if not more important, in a horror style game. Because you are intentionally playing with people's emotions in a very heightened way.
So in your games then, at your tables, how do you introduce and discuss boundaries around content during your session 0?
So I have Monty Cook provided a great one sheet that has all these different topics, and it has a red, yellow, green marker where 100% fine with it. I'm okay with it, but I would want a conversation if it's going to get too intense, and a absolutely not, no go. And so I gave that to all my players and had them fill it out. And there was a place for notes under each item so that they could provide further clarification. Because one of the items on there is pregnancy. And one person put red, and just under they put, not my character. I don't want that to happen. I was like, you are 100% in control of that. That is totally fine. But yeah, I use a questionnaire like that. And then if I have any follow-up questions, I do that. And then at any given moment, we have the X cards on the table where if they are touched, not a wind down, hard stop, pivot, move on to something else. So what about you?
Yeah, so I've been using lines and veils for a long time. Lines being a similar kind of thing. That Monty Cook questionnaire is a great questionnaire and a really useful tool. So lines for me are subject matter and content that is just not going to be in the game in any way, shape, or form.
Yep.
And then veils, as I understand them, is content where the presence of the content is okay, but we don't go into detail, essentially. The X card method is great. Something that I picked up from professional wrestling is the X symbol, which is this is what we always do on camera, and I use it in some tables as well. It's a nice, clear, strong way to make everyone immediately where to stop. What I've been experimenting with recently is a kind of pause, delete, rewind kind of system. So when someone makes the X, they have the option to pause. It might be the case that they actually do want to continue going down this road and are interested in staying with this theme, but just need a moment to collect themselves. And then the delete the delete can basically be used to remove anything that's happened normally, like immediately recently, and just remove it from the game. So it might be the case that a scene has actually played out for a couple of minutes, and then players decided, actually, I'm uncomfortable with this being a thing that's happened to my character. And so when the X card is pulled, and we basically have a delete, and we just wholesale remove that thing from the game. And then the rewind is a chance to go back and do a kind of a scene again, which is a mix between the two, where someone does actually want to do this, but they just want to go about it slightly differently. The rewind thing is relatively new to my table, but I'm experimenting with it at the moment.
No, that sounds super interesting.
Yeah, it actually came out for me mostly out of doing shoots on camera. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, something maybe more private or more personal comes out that someone doesn't want to be public content.
Yep.
So we'll rewind and we'll go again.
Yep.
I think, particularly when you're playing with friends at a table that is being filmed, is sometimes, and this I think is both is mostly a good thing that the players start to forget the camera and forget the future
Yeah.
audience and just really become immersed in the experience of the people in the room. But sometimes that level of comfortability leads to normally just harmless things. But someone going, oh, no, wait a minute, that's private, that's personal. I don't want that to be on the internet.
Yeah.
We'll rewind
Yeah.
back. I've definitely, as someone who works in a therapeutic context, I definitely have to be more careful around certain themes in a public setting than I am at a private table. So I've definitely used that rewind myself a few times, feeling, you know what, we'll take that again.
Yeah. No, I love that. Yeah, this is like just an example of what you're saying with you all shooting. As I recall a recent video with Adam and Sully on the No Rules Bar channel where Sully said Adam's mom's name and Adam just turned to the camera and was like, please bleep out my mother's name, when and the name was bleeped out. But yeah, just moments
That's
like
a
that.
perfect example. Yeah, that's a perfect example. Yeah.
No, I love that. And I love the pause, delete, rewind. That's a great kind of cadence. And I'll have to chew on that for my own table because I do the idea of rewinding. So yeah, that's great. Through the flow of conversation, we are knocking out questions without me needing to ask them, which is wonderful. Just to jump ahead. So have you ever tried to, you talked about the more power fantasy-esque games. Have you ever attempted to run a horror game using one of those systems, or do you pretty well stick to the systems that are built a bit more for them?
I think if I'm going to run a horror game or I have an idea in my head for a horror concept, I will lean towards a horror system. I love horror so much, though, it's hard for it not to creep into. I think I veer more towards a kind of dark fantasy than Tolkien-esque fantasy and D. I don't necessarily mean dark in terms of themes and somberness, but just something more in the realms of European folklore than
Yeah, I got
the more kind of Tolkien-esque elves, dwarves, orcs setting.
Fae are more likely to eat you than dance with you in a meadow kind of thing.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of the supernatural elements from particularly European folklore are inherently horror-esque in their ideas and their theming. So stuff does definitely come in there. I think the only time I've ever tried to run a sort of explicitly horror-themed game, it was in the style of Hammer horror. So it wasn't really attempting to really unnerve or scare the players, but just involve a lot of, I guess, locations and atmosphere and creatures that come from the kind of British Hammer horror, classic horror kind of staples.
Mm-hmm.
It came off the back of stumbling across on Reddit, someone had written a stat block for Shia LaBeouf as a D&D villain.
Yeah.
And I basically ran an adventure where a bunch of misfit heroes who are all the wetwork squad for the Catholic Church have been sent into the European woods somewhere to find out what happened to this once prosperous kind of logging town. And it was all about Shia LaBeouf. I listened very carefully to the lyrics of the song Shia LaBeouf.
Yep.
I did a lot of research into I'm a big researcher for my games. I did a lot of research into his background, like different memes associated with him, things that are known about his sort of movie career, and littered the game with clues pointing towards the fact that the villain here is actually Shia LaBeouf.
That's amazing.
And that wasn't a scary game, but that was Spooky Woods. There was a sinister cult. There was a deal-making hag. I love hags. I think hags are probably my favorite D&D monster. There was this green hag who would answer any question you asked them, but they would take something from you first, something that's important to you, and wouldn't tell you what it was. I love deal-making characters, like satanic kind of Faustian characters, and I feel like in D&D, the hag is the best Faustian character in that book.
What's the worst deal that you've ever inflicted on a player?
Oh, I've inflicted so many. I think the one that comes to mind is because we were talking about that hag. So there was one of the characters in the game was a circus strongman who was a barbarian class who was trying to solve the murder of their lover. And their whole kind of purpose, the reason they were doing work for the church, was to get access to the resources and the money they could use to find out who had killed their lover. And that was the whole reason for being. And the question they asked the hag was, who killed my lover? It was called Sophia Lump. Who killed Sophia Lump? And the hag said that they would tell them, but they would have to take something from them. And so what the hag did was they told them the identity of their lover's killer, and then as their price, they took their love for their dead partner, and
Wow.
they just they were left as this kind of, they still had that barbarian rage, this sort of deep rage that was a part of them before they'd met this woman, and the death of whom had been a key into unlocking this thing which had been much more of a developmental
Yeah.
aspect of their personality. But they'd lost their purpose and their drive, and all they were left with is basically this kind of rage and this nihilism now. And having this answer they've been searching for years, but having no desire to do anything with it because they just didn't care. Um,
Yeah.
they no longer had
Mm,
any feelings at all towards this woman.
it's heartbreaking. I love it.
Yeah, so I was very
Uh,
fond of that. I love playing that hag. I love a
yeah.
hag. I love a hag.
Yeah. So you talked about you really enjoy research and the Shia LaBeouf thing. So do you find yourself, what's, how do you get yourself into the mindset? How do you prepare when you're looking to craft a horror adventure one shot campaign? What do you do to draw from?
Okay, so I think Dread's probably a good example to use for this because it's the one that's freshest in my mind. Is I'll have an idea of the vague setting. So going into Dread, we knew we wanted to do a Wild West setting for the game, and starting with that, I thought I'd be wanting to basically do a kind of homage to Hui Clo, like Sartre's play No Exit about like hell is other people, and I'm really interested in this idea of how people are each other's torturers, and that's how the idea started. So from that broad basic idea of a theme, I had a few things in mind that I knew were going to be a part of that game for sure. I knew what was going to happen when the tower fell. I knew one of the NPCs, Pierre the valet, the main train attendant. But beyond that, I always try to keep the world building side of stuff to a bare minimum until I've spoken to the players. So then we sat down and had a sort of our session zero, where I pitched the general idea to them. The idea was you're going to be taking your first trip from east to west across the frontier in a luxury train. So have a think about what reason you're heading west for, and tell me what sort of broad character archetype you'd like to play. And so they each pitched Undertaker, politician, stage magician at that point in time. And then with that broad idea of what the setting was, and with that broad idea of which these individual characters' character class, I guess, for the purposes of Dread was, I then went away and wrote a 10-question questionnaire for each of them. And then everything that fleshed out the body of the game. When the tower falls, there's a train attendant valet who will be collecting tickets. Beyond that, I fleshed out the rest really of the body of the game with stuff that I'd taken from the players' questionnaires. I would read through their answers. I would do as much research as I could into all the relevant areas. So we had a character who was an alchemist. So I looked deep into alchemy and the history of alchemy and the areas of alchemy this character was interested in. Taking Hope Puckett's character as an example, the character of the bartender, the whiskey, the tequila with the worm, the tarot cards, the box, all of that stuff is all drawn from their character sheet. So
Nice.
I try to take as much as possible from that. But I think particularly with a horror one shot as well, but with any game really, because players are going to be more invested in stuff they've made themselves. So I really very consciously don't build too much of the world until I've got a lot of info
Yeah.
from the players. And then I do a bunch of research, and I use that research combined with some research of the period, if it's a historical game, or the kind of area of folklore or myth that we're looking into, if it's a sort of fantasy or supernatural game. And even though that is a rule that applies to any setting, I think it's like we touched on at the start of this chat, it's a really useful one for horror,
Mm.
is every significant thing that those players encounter is, oh, that's from my character sheet. Oh, that's from my character sheet. Oh, that's something I created.
Yeah.
And it just
Yeah.
keeps them really invested.
That's great.
So that's kind of my process, really. Broad idea, session zero. I spend a lot of time with players individually working on character creation and getting as much information as they can. And then I basically write's probably too strong a word, but like structure the story from that.
Mhm.
And also in a one shot, I will never, a lesson I learned a while ago, but I will leave act 3 of a 3-act story almost entirely unplanned. There might be a
Okay.
couple of things I feel like, okay, this thing for structure reasons needs to happen here, but I really will just let act 3 happen as it does, because I've got myself stuck in the past when I've become really attached to a particular kind of thing happening, or a particular kind of ending, or a particular kind of outcome. When I felt like, this is the optimum thing to happen in act 3, I've got really attached to it. And then when the player hasn't gone there, I found myself trying to make it happen, and it's not
Mhm.
very satisfying for the player. My attempts at doing it are candid. Yeah, I had to learn that lesson several times
Yeah.
before it stuck in. But now I will leave Act 3 as unwritten as possible,
Gotcha.
and just build it out of what happened in Act 1 and 2.
Okay. Do you ever make adjustments to your plans based on, and I think this is like for people that game with the same group pretty consistently, but maybe not the exact, like you have a large friend group and you have different people at different tables. And what I'm specifically thinking of is like when you were planning out Dread, you obviously had a player at your table, Sullivan, who can't help but draw joy out of everybody at the table through his words and antics. And so, do you ever, in your prepping, account for the different personalities and players at the table and how they're going to interact with the story? And is that part of your structuring?
Yeah, I would say so. It's a slightly different situation depending on whether it's a private game or whether it's
Of course,
content.
yeah.
I think Sullivan is an incredibly dependable performer. He will always find something to do in a scene. He will always find a way to make his character act in what's happening. In the case of Dread, it is by asking literally everybody he comes across whether they will vote for him or not. I guess my approach as a general approach for players who have a more kind of comedic style is I just treat everything they do seriously. It
Mm.
may be very funny and it may laugh, but the things they say and the sometimes outlandish or silly actions they take, I always try to ask myself, what's the actual consequence of this? I find this is, I think, my general rule, regardless of the play style, is I'm very big on thinking about what are the consequences of this choice. And that for me is really how an RPG story writes itself, is you help the players create characters they're invested in. You create a world as much as you need to and a broad idea of what's going on. And then the whole story is just written out of the consequences of player actions and player choices.
100%. That's the
So
primary reason I try to encourage my players to at least not necessarily an accent, but a distinct character voice, because the rule at my table is out of character. Yeah, you can say, if you say something in character, you've said it in character. And so the people around you are going to respond to your admittedly very hilarious joke like they would as people. And a lot of my players give me grief for that. But no, it's a fun way to tell a story.
yeah, it's a really good call, I think, because I think a lot of the time players are just trying to affect the world around them. And I think that's where
Mhm.
murder hoboing often comes from. Partly it
Mhm.
comes from people's first time playing D&D when they're just testing the boundaries of the world. But in situations where I've seen that kind of murder hobo behavior crop up, it's often because players don't feel like what they're doing is affecting the story. It often comes as a pushback against kind of railroading. And so as long as a player feels like their actions are affecting the world around them, I think they tend to make more meaningful choices. And what
Mhm.
you talked about there about the player heard you a joke, when something goes from being I'm just going to say this funny thing that's come to mind, to make my friends at the table laugh, which is a wonderful thing to do. That's
Mhm.
one thing. But when they start seeing how the jester element of this character is having effect on the game world, then sometimes they start to think differently about, well, okay,
I think it's such a fun way to see people get immersed into the world once they realize that, oh, my character's voice carries weight no matter what they're doing. And I think that's why I've really begun encouraging people to explore outside of D&D, because I think another aspect of the murder hobo situation is you read through the player's handbook rules and the overwhelming majority is weapons, armor, combat, turn order, offensive spells, all these things. And so it's like your tools are a hammer, so every NPC is going to begin to look like a nail that you just need to smash through. Whereas something like Dread or 10 Candles, where it's not combat focused in the way the rules are written, it opens up that scope and that view to, okay, I'm just a person in this world, not a combatant that is fighting my way towards my goals.
yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah, so much, the vast majority of the crunch in a D&D book is combat related.
Yeah.
And as much as the player's handbook starts off by saying there are the three pillars of D&D: combat, exploration, and role play, most of the rules are about fighting, and it takes a lot of legwork on the part of the DM to make those other elements as significant a presence in the game. And so
Yeah.
I think for new DMs and people who are new to running games who don't want a combat heavy game, yeah, leading towards other systems. I
Yeah.
think a lot of the Powered by Apocalypse games are really good at doing this, where you can have an entire game system which is based around how to romance your supernatural crush or something.
Yeah. 100%. one thing that I've run into with horror adventures or moments of terror, and this two-pronged question. The first one deals with like player agency, where one system, the podcast that I GM for, uses the Genesis role-playing game system, which uses the narrative dice from Star Wars Fantasy Flight Games. And they have actual fear checks where when the player characters encounter something that would elicit fear, they make a roll. And if they fail, they both have these mechanical detriments, but also the idea is your character is afraid. But oftentimes, especially in these more heroic driven games, you have players who don't like the breaking of their character's will and spirit being taken away from them and given over to the mechanics. Have you ever run into that kind of back and forth?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, yeah, with D&D as an example, people often go into D&D wanting to play someone who's afraid of things. And I think, like, I'm not, someone correct me if I'm using these terms inaccurately, but my GM style is very much simulationist over narrativist. So I
Mm.
really like games. I always try to run games where the players have no knowledge outside of what their character knows, and
Okay.
where they have infinite agency to make choices as their character, but they can't step outside of their character to make choices about the game in the way that you might be able to in Fiasco, Powered by the Apocalypse System. I do
Gotcha.
those
Okay.
games, but my preference is really simulationist. And I think in a simulationist setting, to tell a player how their character is feeling, to me, that can feel as sucky as telling a person in regular life how they're feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I really feel that immersion is always higher if a player has complete autonomy over their emotional world.
Mm.
Dr. Mekin Cornell, who had this series on YouTube for a while called Psychology at the Table, she's a clinical psychologist who uses D&D as a therapeutic tool. She talked about when you are describing a player's fear reaction to something, focus on the physiological symptoms rather than on the stuff
Mm.
inside their mind. Talk about
Gotcha.
things like the old classics about hair on the neck standing up, chill through the skin. So in an unconscious way, their body is reacting to something which it physically senses as danger, but you're not telling a
Mm.
player you're scared of this, which people can really push
That's very,
back
very good.
against.
Yeah.
So I think that really helps with like power fantasy games like D&D. And yeah, I'm gonna have to check into that Genesis system, because if the act of being afraid is woven into the mechanic of the game, and again, I think if you have a conversation about it in session 0, I'm always really clear when introducing someone to Call of Cthulhu that at times mostly failed sanity rolls. As the keeper, I will at times decide something that your character does that you don't choose to do as a
Yeah.
sort of byproduct of that failed roll,
Hmm.
and make sure everyone's on board with that. And I think a lot of these things, going into the game knowing that, okay, within these specific contexts, I'm going to lose control of my character, people are mostly cool with it.
Yep. 100%.
I've definitely been in that situation as a player too, where I've got really pissy because I've been told that I think I was told that I was angry at myself for something. And I felt, I don't feel a little piece of guilt about this. Don't you tell me how I feel.
Yeah. No, that's
Yeah.
great.
So letting players own their inner lives, I think, is.
That's a great way to put it. I really like the succinctness of that. The additional difficulty that in a recent session with that Genesis system, was right after the fear check they had to make. I had them going up against Lovecraftian-esque entities, not from this plane of existence. They were from the plane of madness. And you read Lovecraft's fiction, and you get very little physical description of the elders and these entities because they are indescribable to our language. And that's ultimately what I had to land on when describing these things, is to describe what they look like would cheapen the impact of what they're doing to your mind right now. And I'm really interested as somebody that has played in systems like that. And how do you handle the undescribable horrors of the multiverse?
Have you ever read Stephen King's cocaine-fueled free association book, Dance Macabre, where he just rambles about horror for 400 pages?
I have not, but I will add it to my list.
I really like that book. And he talks about something which I think is someone else's theory he's sharing, recounting, called the 100-foot bug theory. And he talks about being in a cinema and watching a protagonist wait outside the entrance to a spooky-looking house,
Hmm.
slowly open the door, and then look up the hallway up a long flight of steps towards the upper landing where there's another door, and creep their way up the steps terrified of what they're going to see. And they reach the top and they put their hand on the door handle, and everyone in the audience starts to think, oh my God, what's behind that door? What's behind that door? It could be anything. It could be my worst nightmare. And she opens the door and there's a 10-foot bug behind it. She screams and the audience screams. And then everyone feels kind of breathes a sigh of relief and says, well, it was a 10-foot bug. At least it wasn't a 20-foot bug, because that would have been really scary.
Yeah.
And that basically propped them exponentially, that once you see what the monster looks like, it is defined and it is understandable. And when you don't know what it is, especially if you're in a heightened state of fear, your brain fills in the gaps with the thing that's going to scare you the most. Like, I'm scared of giant squids, and I spent the first act of Cloverfield worried it was going to be a tentacle-based monster, and felt a huge sigh of relief when it wasn't. So I think it's exactly what you're saying there, is that if you were to describe, I think in a sense of cosmic horror, if you were to describe the indescribable, it wouldn't be indescribable, and it loses this sense of something the mind can't comprehend. But I try to apply that rule even with the most mundane, ordinary-looking things. I try my best to never give a detailed or explicit description of what the monster is. If it's something more common, like a werewolf, I will give enough minor details so that the player can piece it together. But I feel like when describing monsters in a horror game, when running a horror game in general and the players are uncovering a mystery, or I think any kind of mystery, even not horror-based, or almost any kind of game, is that I always try to never provide the answers to anything and never put the pieces together. I'll give the players all the pieces they need, but I really try to steer away from expositional villains who reveal what their plan was, or the point where you see the monster and describe what the monster is, or the point where you say, oh yeah, everyone, you're all dead and this train is purgatory. I'll never make any solution explicit. That's like a hard rule for me in horror, and a softer rule in fantasy and other settings, never making anything explicit. And so with cosmic horror, it's just really think something I've just stolen from Lovecraft, and I guess Derleth and Brian Lumley and some of the other Lovecraftian authors, is just pick a couple of details that kind of give an impression of something and describe that.
Yeah.
A flurry of something, or like too many teeth. Leave it at that.
A lot of times when I'm running things that I want the players to be scared of, I will rely a lot on non-player characters and their responses. Because there's a great story that I heard Sam Witwer tell, where he was in an acting class where Gary Oldman was visiting, and talked about, he was in rehearsal and he was playing a king in a drama. And the director basically said, when you're coming off stage, you don't feel kingly enough. And Gary Oldman's response was, the director was, then you should be giving notes to the other people on stage, because how other people respond is what actually informs the position of a character. I could walk on as like the most heightened regal, but if they're snickering, that's going to inform the audience much more to who my character is than anything I can do. And as an actor and a director, obviously that got put in the back of my brain forever. But I think it's very applicable to running tabletop games, especially horror, is you have the agency as the GM with the non-player characters around to inform how terrifying a thing that you're presenting without needing to describe the thing itself. You can describe how other people are responding to it.
Yeah, that's really good. That's really good advice. Yeah. Is that Sam Witwer was in Starkiller, Sam Witwer?
Yes. Okay. So your most memorable, perhaps spine-chilling, scariest moment that you've had running a horror game, like where you really just, you knew you nailed it kind of thing.
Oh, in terms of scariest, it was something really small. It was just a rat coming out from behind some wreckage, but it was during a game of Dread, and I managed to successfully get a jump scare reaction from someone just by talking in a very level tone. I think there was something about the atmosphere in that table and how into it everyone in that table was. It wasn't even like a raise in my voice and go, boo, it's a rat. But they were so tense just looking what was behind this little bit of flotsam or something in the back of this shed, that when this sort of rat jumped out of them, they jumped. And this
awesome.
Might be a particularly skittish person. There's a lot of factors at play there, but that was definitely fun.
That's fine.
That was definitely feeling like, okay, everyone here is really investing their all into the energy in the room. That's probably the out and out scariest, biggest scare. Just an end of a Goosebumps chapter. Oh, it's just a rat kind of cheap scare.
Yeah,
but that was satisfying.
That's great. Yeah.
Beyond that, I think the stuff that really sticks with me in terms of impactful is the sort of more tragic stuff. So I can't quite remember the details, but I remember the final moments of my first game of 10 Candles I ran just being incredibly heavy, just really heavy. And that's a really good feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, in horror games, the moments which feel, looking back, like where I feel like I've really done a good job with a horror game are the moments of tragedy, I think, more than the
Yeah.
scares, which stick with me.
When you understand that you've gotten that level of investment from the players, that they really are heartbroken that things didn't work out. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the real treats of making role playing content is that I get to look at the faces of players that I'm not looking at when I'm playing the game. So
Mm.
I'm normally going to be focused on the person that I'm talking to, and watching content back, I do get to see other people's reactions to scenes that aren't their own. And that's a delight. And I'm so incredibly proud of the character work that Adam did, that everyone did, but for the purpose of this example, that Adam did in Dread, and just how hard he was hit by finding out his character's fate. That was a big moment for me personally. That's a player like, this is someone who's really invested in the person they're playing. This is someone who's really just put their all into this character and is
Mhm.
really heartbroken about what's happened to them. So those are the moments I think I live for in
Yeah.
a horror game.
If you are introducing an NPC that you want to seem scary, or for me, if I want somebody to be like scary and nefarious and like instantly put the players on edge, I tend to go very like American South gentleman, like Southern politician kind of thing. Because for some reason that just like that's the violin string that just makes everybody go, oh, I don't like this person. So do you have a go-to that you jump to when you want to do that?
I do love an evil mayor, not necessarily in a horror setting strictly, but I generally love an evil mayor. I
Hmm.
think probably two of my most go-to archetypes that appear the most are evil mayors and bad dads. So there is something really fun about an evil mayor. I love playing crooked, corrupt mayors. I've played many, but in terms of I think I always tie NPCs as much as I can to player characters. So I think in a horror game, horror one shot, like everyone will have one NPC specifically, which is like their NPC, which is designed to push their buttons.
Hmm.
And yeah, I think for me, I'll look at the character I'm trying to scare. Often it'll be one I'm trying to scare more than the others, and I will just think, what are this person's buttons, and I'll make someone who pushes those. But yeah, I do love doing. There's like you said, there's something about the evil mayor voice which is fun. I love a femme
Yeah.
fatale as well. I love playing femme
Yeah.
fatales. There's something about a femme fatale which is great as a horror villain, because I feel like that a femme fatale is often a 2-act story in a horror game. The first
Mm.
act is them luring a character in by affirming everything that they want to see about themselves. They're the this is Chloe again. This idea that we only exist as we are perceived by other people, and that to be perceived by someone else is like existentially painful. And so a femme fatale can initially treat someone exactly how they want to be seen, as heroic, as brave, as clever. And then the second act of a femme fatale's presence in a story is basically the complete opposite, and just digging deep into that character's insecurities.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's a really fun way to rattle people.
Yeah. No, I
Uh,
love, yeah. You mentioning no exit before, like the hell is other people concept, which in the context of that show, it's the gaze of other people, like having to exist and perform for other people is hell. And yeah, yeah, that's very good. I like that.
I think it was one of the themes going into Dread that I really wanted to. Everyone had one question in their questionnaire which explored that theme. Like, how do you see yourself compared to how you see other people? What do you like? What is it about the way people see you that you try to reaffirm? And what do you hate about yourself that you try to hide from others?
Yeah.
And that kind of dichotomy is, I think, incongruence like that is just a huge part of being a human being. Like, we're
Yeah.
all basically, depending on what modality you look at, I think there's kind of something that's common in most psychotherapeutic modalities is this idea of conflict between opposing forces, who we naturally are or who we think we are, or what we want and what we think we should do. And I feel like that's the heart of every character everywhere. Dread was a game to more explicitly look at that kind of stuff, but I find myself drawn to that an awful lot in any
Yeah.
context. But in horror
Yeah.
games, yeah, for sure. And speaking of someone who's, you must be in the same position yourself, as people who make recorded content that is put online, it's really stressful, people looking at you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's real stressful.
You're very aware of everything that you do while a camera's pointed at you after a couple times watching back the footage. Oh, why is my face like that? Like, why am I holding my body that way? You become very aware that other people are looking at you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yeah, I'm always very keen to just bring up the fact that, like, I'm someone who's incredibly anxious on camera,
Yeah.
has like big imposter syndrome. You've been wonderful and very welcoming to me here. I'm really grateful for it. And it has helped me fight the imposter syndrome I always get on camera. Like, why does anyone want to know what the hell I have to say about anything?
Yeah. Yeah. I
Um,
still have that. Every video I post, I'm like, why would anybody watch this?
so I think sometimes people see, it's more of a side point, but what I always try to champion is that people see someone on a channel and think these people are really confident and these people are so self-assured and so together.
Yeah.
And we're all just really anxious people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
100%. Yeah.
we're really anxious.
Well,
And we all worry an awful lot.
I was joking on the podcast with that table that I'm a big fan of dramatic irony a lot of times in tabletop role playing games. But I feel like that's a tool that's not used a whole lot because as GMs, we want to, like you had mentioned, like simulationist, where like all of the information, like if your character doesn't know it, then you don't know it kind of thing. And I tend to play a little bit more on the narrative end of the scale where I'll let the players know, like I'll do cutaway, like third person scenes to the villains and things like that, or NPCs making big decisions that will affect the players, but their characters have no idea that this thing is happening across the city kind of thing. And because I think that can ramp up the tension in a really interesting way. But I've recently started playing with, I don't even know the term for it because it's not dramatic irony. I will have NPCs freely give player characters the information that they need to solve the problems, but I package it in a way to where there's no reasonable expectation that the player characters would believe this person. But the players know. The players know that the information is credible and valid, but they know that their characters would not accept this information. And it creates another interesting layer of tension of my character has the information, but they will not act on it because there's no reason they would. And that's killing me inside. And so I think that there are ways that you can play with information in that way that's very fun and interesting.
Absolutely. I think even if you're running a more straight simulationist game, unless your party's together all the time, there are going to be scenes where members of the party are in a place where the other players aren't. So there's always going to be a degree to which players need to, or have the option to, choose to disregard something that they've heard in another scene, which they know their
Yeah.
character doesn't know. And that's really, see, I think that's something that would be really interesting to introduce into a horror setting because so much of horror is around suboptimal choices or moving towards the thing that is going to kill you rather than away from it. That idea of introducing information that will keep a player safe, that the player knows is information that will keep them safe, but which they know comes from a source that their character is mistrustful of, is really interesting. I think particularly in horror.
Yeah.
It's like a really useful tool for horror.
Yeah. It'd be fun to use in a horror game.
Because I suppose it's such a trope heavy thing as well. Like horror is the tropes of horror are so clear that in a horror role playing game, if everyone was playing like sensible, rational human beings, they'd probably be okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's that I forget what film critic said it, but it was like in horror movies, you ask, why don't they call the police? And so then the movie wouldn't happen. Like it's just sometimes you have to make a conceit for the sake of the format and the genre. So yeah.
Such a trope heavy and such a clearly defined genre. Yeah, maybe horror games are by their nature unavoidably narrativist to a certain degree because everyone in that game knows what the tropes are and are consciously leaning into them because they know what a horror story is.
Yeah. And even in a game like 10 Candles, correct me if I'm wrong, but in the rule book, it tells the players like your character will be dead by the end of the game. There's no escaping that fact. So yeah, that creates that sense of meta knowledge of dying, which I really want to play that game.
10 Candles really does play with that kind of idea of a player taking narrativist control because at the beginning, players are getting to resolve the results of dice rolls. So the game begins with 10 die, and as long as one of them is a 6, it counts as a success. And on a success, the player who rolls gets to narrate what happens. And on a failure, the GM gets to narrate what happens. So narrative control actually in 10 Candles at the beginning of the game is mostly in the hands of the player. And as a failure happens and a candle is extinguished and you move closer to the end, failures become more and more common and the GM starts to take more and more control over the narrative. So it's a kind of exchanging of narrative control from the start of the story to the end. So it's a heavily narrativist game, 10 Candles. But still, still a profoundly moving game.
Yeah. Tom, I think we have pretty thoroughly covered horror, gaming, and a few other topics also over the course of this discussion, which has been wonderful. Thank you so much for giving me your time and hanging out and chatting about games and characters and theater and all kinds of stuff. Is there anything that you would like to plug for the people? They can go see more of you if they've had a good time, which I'm sure they have.
Well, thanks again for having me on and letting me ramble about stuff. Not really much to plug. Go watch Dread. I'm really, really proud of Dread. Yeah, I think that is a good old spooky game with
Yeah.
some real depth.
Yeah.
So yeah, check out.
I'll put a link down there right below this video. So
Yeah.
go click that link and check out Tom doing what he does well. So,
Yeah, thanks very much.
okay. Thank you all so much for watching. This has been Tom. I have been Eric, and I will see you next time.